Hi everyone and welcome to this week's Sunday night video. This week I am covering the very strange story of George Bell, Thomas Riddell and the attempted murder of Mary Robinson, which took place in the Gateshead area in 1842. I hope you will find the story interesting. Sadly, due to the age of this story, the past lives of all of those involved in this week's case was almost impossible to find, so their backstories really will be very basic. George Bell was said to be around 26 years old, so would have been born in around 1816. His parents and place of birth are unknown. However, in 1842 he was living at Windy Nook and worked as a quarryman. He was described as having a black bushy whiskers, which met under his chin, not a beard as such, but more a frame of hair around his chin, which apparently made him very easy to identify. Thomas Riddell was said to be around 21 years old in 1842, so would have been born in around 1821. His parents and place of birth are unknown. He was living in the Gateshead area in 1842 and also working as a quarryman. He was described as being a rather sullen man with little to no concern about the crime he had allegedly committed. Mary Robinson, the victim, lived in Gateshead with her lodger, Miss Clark, and a servant by the name of Ruth Lawson. Mary's age is not given and her place of birth and parents are unknown. Although Mary seems to be able to live on her own means, this was no doubt helped by the money from her lodger. She was not a rich woman, however, people in the area seemed to believe she had money hidden in her home. Before we go any further, can I just say, if you do find this video interesting, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. It really is very much appreciated. And it is completely free to subscribe, so it doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify. So I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. In the early hours of November the 27th, 1842, Mary Robinson was asleep in her bed when she was awoken by a noise. On looking around her, she saw a light and at first thought it was Ruth Lawson coming to check on her. As her eyes began to focus, she quickly realized it was not Ruth but two men. Their faces were covered in dirt, but she could see them quite well as one of the men was holding a candle. One man spoke, saying to Mary, "Your money or your life." Mary told him she had no money, but he said she must have. Mary then attempted to get out of bed, but she was struck 2 heavy blows on the head, which knocked her unconscious briefly. When she came round a short time later, the men were gone. Ruth Lawson was sent to Thomas Ferguson's house for help, as he was the closest neighbour to Mary's home. When Thomas arrived, he sent for the police and also examined the house while he waited for them to arrive, and a doctor was sent for to examine Mary, who was bleeding badly from a wound to her head. Acting on information received and the fact that George Bell and Thomas Riddell had been seen in the area and George matched the description from Mary, the two men were arrested on a charge of attempted murder and burglary. It seems that the two men were known to the police as they had been suspects for a robbery in Windy Nook in around 1839, where around £250 had been stolen from a shop. However, they had vanished immediately after the money was stolen, and it had only just been discovered that they had gone to America, returning to the northeast around a year later, and had been keeping a low profile until the attack on Mary Robinson. The court hearing, which was held in Gateshead in December of 1842, was quite a simple one, and it was slightly different to others as there was very little evidence given. It was stated that both men had been in a public house in Sandgate in Newcastle on November the 26th and had got into a fight. This had caused Thomas to use his handkerchief to wipe blood from his face. The police stated that a blood-stained handkerchief had been found on the stairs of the home of Mary Robinson after the attack, and as the blood was dry, it was believed that this belonged to Thomas Riddell. When the two men were arrested, Thomas Riddell was found to have some old cloth in his room covered in charcoal, and it was believed that this had been used to clean himself up after the attack on Mary. When the police went to George Bell's home in Windy Nook, they found a dagger, various articles of linen, and some gold rings. It had been stated that the men had stolen money from Mary Robinson. However, it was not stated that this money had been found in either of the men's possession. Both George and Thomas had given a statement to the police after their arrest. George stated that he had gone to Newcastle on the 26th for a few drinks, and he had, at first, denied that he had even seen Thomas, but that he later said he had seen him in a pub at Sandgate. George said he had not seen any fight take place when he had been in the pub with Thomas. He said he had left him there and had gone home and had been in bed sometime between midnight and 1 a.m. Thomas stated that he had met George just outside of Windy Nook and they had travelled to Newcastle together. He spoke of the fight that had taken place but said he had wiped his face on his shirt sleeve and had not used his handkerchief. He was then told that his shirt had been examined and there was no blood on it, to which he replied, "My mother must have wiped it off." Charles Dunn of Gateshead said he had been in the area on the night of the 27th. He had seen the two men who fitted the description of the prisoners sitting on a fence near to the home of Mary Robinson. He said as he passed them, they turned their heads as if trying to avoid being recognised. Several other men who were not named also spoke of seeing the two men in the Gateshead area around the time the crime was committed. Some said they knew the prisoners well, others said the men they saw were very like the men in the dock. Others, who were again not named, spoke of George and Thomas as being men who were of notoriously bad character and just generally not very nice men. Mary Robinson, who had not been present for the entire hearing, on seeing the two men for the first time in court, shouted out, "Oh dear me, that is one of the men," pointing towards George Bell. Mary gave evidence stating that she lived in Gateshead with Ruth Lawson and Miss Clark. She said that on the night of the 27th she had gone to bed sometime between 10 and 11 p.m. She said she was awoken at around 3 a.m. by a noise. She said she had raised herself in the bed and called out, "Is that you, Ruth?" Mary said no sooner had she said these words than she noticed the two men at her bedside. She said they had black on their faces as if trying to hide their identity, and they had rags of some kind over their mouths. She said one of the men was very tall and the other not so tall. The tall man had a candle in his hand, and both men seemed to have rags over their heads, as neither of them were wearing a hat. Mary said that the man with the candle spoke to her saying, "Your money or your life." She said she told him, "I have no money." He had replied saying, "You have money." Mary said she told them if they would let her get up, she would get it for them. One of the men said, she said she was not sure who, said, "Lie still and hold your tongue." The shorter man, Mary said, had been standing away from the bed. She knew he had something in his hand, but she could not say what. But he now stepped forward and struck her twice on the head with whatever it was he had in his hand, and the blow, she said, caused her to black out. Mary continued, saying that once she came round, the men had gone, and Ruth had entered the room. Ruth went to find Mr. Ferguson so that they could get some help. She said it was later found that the rooms downstairs had been ransacked, but she had not been aware at the time that any items or money were missing from her home. She then looked directly at George, and in a state of some excitement she cried out, "It's him! I know it's him!" George then asked Mary if she had ever seen him before. She said she had not. She said she had never noticed him in the area before, but had taken great notice of him that night and was certain that he was the same man who had been in her home. George then said he had passed her home many times in the past and she must surely have seen him before. Mary insisted that she had not. George then said he had nothing more to say, other than the fact that Mary had sinned by saying it was him that night when it was not. George then asked for some policemen to be called who he claimed had seen him in another area that night. However, no one could confirm this. Thomas then shouted out that Mary could not identify him at all and that he had been in bed at the time the attack took place. Richard Parker of Gateshead said he had been in a public house in Newcastle on the night of the crime. He said it was getting on for 1 a.m. when he saw George Bell. He said he was alone at first, but Thomas Riddell came and joined him. He said he left the area after this, but saw the two men heading off together. Margaret Scott of Gateshead said she remembered around a week before the crime passing the home of Mary Robinson. She said the two men were at the gates. One was peering through the railings and the other was standing beside him. She said they looked like they were up to no good. She was sure the two men in the dock were those same two men that she had seen. No further evidence was given, and the magistrates, after a brief discussion, committed both men for a trial on a charge of attempted murder and burglary. The trial was held at Durham before Baron Rolfe in April of 1843, and both George and Thomas pleaded not guilty. And unusually, there is actually more information from the trial than from the earlier magistrates' hearing. At the start of the trial, it was stated that when Mary Robinson's house had been searched, a crowbar had been found. It was believed this had been used to force open the door. 2 handkerchiefs had been found on the stairs, the one with dried blood on it and another one. And a chest belonging to Ruth Lawson had been broken open, and from this a shawl, a sovereign, a half sovereign, and 3 shillings had been taken. The shawl had been found in the field a short distance away from the house, along with the footprints of 2 men, and it was stated that one of the footprints matched the size of Thomas Riddell's shoes. Mary Robinson repeated her early evidence and was questioned about identifying George Bell. She stated as soon as she had seen him, she knew he was one of the men. She said his eyes had not been kindly eyes, and he had looked at her the same way he had done on the night of the attack. At this point, she had got very upset and had to be removed from the court. Ruth Lawson said she worked as a servant for Miss Robinson in Gateshead. She said on the night of the crime, Mary had gone to bed at around 10:30 p.m. She said she herself went to bed at around midnight, and all the doors had been locked before she went to bed. In fact, she said, the back kitchen door had not been unlocked for several days. She said at around 3 a.m. she was awoken by the cries of murder from Mary's rooms. She went into the passage and shouted that she was coming. She said she then heard a man's voice telling Mary to hold her tongue and lie still. At first, she said she'd been afraid and had gone back to her own room, but she heard Mary cry out murder again, so she got a light and went back towards her room. She said when she went inside, Mary was standing by the bed and blood was pouring from her head, and at first she thought her throat had been cut. Mary spoke to her and told her to fetch Mr. Ferguson, and Ruth said she left to do this. She said Mr. Ferguson searched the rooms, and it was then that she found the box in the kitchen that belonged to her that had been broken into. She said the items from it had been stolen. She said she also found the poker was missing, and she clearly remembered leaving this by the fire before she went to bed. Thomas Ferguson said he lived in the house next door to Mary Robinson. It was not exactly next door, but it was very close. He said in the early hours of the 27th he was awoken by his dog barking. He thought this may have been at around 2 a.m. He said he could not see anything wrong, so he went back to bed. Thomas said he was then awoken again sometime between 3 and 4 a.m. by Ruth Lawson, and she had told him that Mary had been attacked. Thomas said he had called on a friend by the name of Mr. Lamb, who never gave evidence, and they had gone to the house together. He said he found Mary in a dazed state. She had a wound to her head, and someone had placed a cloth over it. He said he had assisted her back to her bedroom, and in her room he said he had found an iron bar. He also spoke of finding the 2 handkerchiefs, and he said he had given the iron bar to P.C. Wilkinson. Thomas spoke of the police arriving and how he had helped them to search the area. He said they had found footprints in the back field, and this was also where they had found the missing shawl and the poker. He ended by saying that the footprints were going in the direction of Windy Nook. Joseph Short of Gateshead said he remembered seeing the two prisoners on the night of the 26th. He said they had been on the road near to the home of Mary Robinson. He said there was a route to their home in Windy Nook that did not pass Miss Robinson's house, but they seemed to have walked the long way round. John Dixon of Gateshead said he had seen the two men near to Mary Robinson's house many times in the past few days. He said he had seen them there on the night of the crime, leaning against a wall. William Graham of Gateshead said he had been in Sandgate on the night of the 26th. He had been in one of the public houses when George and Thomas came in together. He said he had argued with Thomas and had struck him a blow. He said Thomas's face had been bleeding and he saw him use a handkerchief to wipe away the blood. He said, however, he would not be able to identify the handkerchief if he saw it again. He said he later saw George and Thomas leave the pub together. Richard Parkin of Gateshead said he had seen the fight take place. He said he did not think any of the men were drunk at the time. He said he saw George and Thomas again at around 1 a.m. standing at Sandgate in Newcastle. He said it was not unusual to see men standing around in the streets at that time of the morning. He could not say for sure if the men were still sober, as he did not speak to them. Superintendent Rudd said he had been told of the incident on the 27th and had gone to Mary's house between 6 and 7 a.m. He said he had examined the house and also outside. He had seen the footprints leading in the direction of Windy Nook, and these footprints had been measured. He said he had gone to the home of Thomas Riddell and had found some shoes that Thomas said were his. These had been measured and matched the size of the footprints exactly. He said he had also found some clothing that was damp and marked with soot or charcoal, as if it had been used to clean something like a dirty face. He said he had also visited the home of George Bell, and both men had been arrested. He said they had both given the statements that had been read out at the magistrate's hearing. P.C. Scory said he had been sent to the home of Thomas Riddell to find the shirt he said had blood on it. He said he'd returned with 3 shirts and Thomas had picked out one which had some small marks on it. He said Thomas claimed they were bloodstains, but P.C. Scory said he did not think they were. P.C. Wilkinson said he had been called to the home of Mary Robinson on the morning of the 27th. He said he'd been given the iron bar, a crowbar, by Mr. Ferguson. He said this had been looked at by Michael Parkinson, who said it belonged to his brother. Michael Parkinson of Gateshead said he had examined the iron bar. He said it was one he used for work, so he knew it well. It had been left on a cart and had gone missing. He said he had not seen it again until P.C. Wilkinson had shown it to him. P.C. Young said he had also been called to the home of Mary Robinson. He said when he arrived, Thomas Ferguson had given him 2 handkerchiefs and the poker. He had shown the poker to Ruth Lawson, and she had identified it as the one from the home of Miss Robinson. Robert Davis said he was a surgeon at Gateshead. He was also the current mayor of Gateshead. He said he had been called to see Mary Robinson on the morning of the 27th. He said she had a severe wound to her head, the skull was visible, and she was quite poorly. The iron bar produced could easily have caused these wounds. He said he had taken care of her since the attack, and she was recovering well. Dr. Davis said he had also spoken to the mother of George Bell. She had told him that she wanted him to confess to his crime, but George's wife had said he was at home in bed at the time. This last part I found quite strange, as no one had mentioned George having a wife, and she did not give any evidence to state that her husband had been at home in bed at the time of the attack. Miss Clark, the other person who lived at the home of Mary Robinson, never gave any evidence. It was never made clear if she had heard the disturbance, but she does not appear to have had anything to add to the case. No further evidence was given, and the defence did not call any witnesses. However, he did speak to the jury, stating that Mary Robinson must have been in a great state of the excitement on the night the crime took place. He said this, along with the fact that she had just woken from sleep and the two men had almost all of their faces hidden and covered in soot, that it meant it was impossible for her to have identified one of them so clearly. He said there was little to no evidence to convict the men of the crime they had been charged with. No money had been found, and most of the evidence was circumstantial. He said if the jury felt that Mary Robinson had been mistaken when she identified George Bell, then they must find both men not guilty. Sadly, I did not find any details of the judge's summing up, and in this case it is quite difficult to guess what he may have said. The jury retired for around 10 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of burglary and attempted murder against both men. When asked if they had anything to say before sentence was passed, George Bell loudly stated that he was an innocent man. Thomas Riddell, however, declined to speak. The judge then spoke to both men, telling them that they had been found guilty of a terrible crime, and had this taken place a few years ago, they would have both been hung. However, although they would still receive a sentence of death, this would not be carried out. They would instead both be transported to a foreign land for the rest of their lives. On leaving the courtroom, Thomas Riddell raised his arm and shouted to the room, "Well, I never expected to get any justice here." Sadly, I was not able to find where the two men were sent to or if they ever returned to the UK. Now, although the judge said that they would be transported for life, many people did return to the UK after several years. However, more often than not, the men sent for transportation would die either during the journey or in the country they were sent to. Or, if they were lucky to survive the trip and be released, many would stay and never return to their homeland. This was a most baffling case. From start to finish, it makes very little sense. I can see that George and Thomas may have thought Mary had money in her house, and I can also see that many people saw them loitering in the area in the days leading up to the crime. But I can see little else that makes them guilty. I have to agree with the defence a little bit. With their faces almost completely covered and one man hiding in the darkness, how on earth could Mary be so sure they were the men who attacked her? And the evidence itself was also a bit strange. It seemed to rest mostly on the two handkerchiefs and the fact that one of those had blood on it, and on a footprint of a similar size to one of Thomas Riddell's shoes. No money was found on either of the men, and no evidence that they had spent any money either. No one saw them enter Mary's home, and all that was said about them was that they had been seen in the area. Was Mary really sure she had seen George Bell just from his eyes, and only seeing him by the dim light of the candle after she had just woken up? Or did she simply believe it was him, and once she had decided that, convinced herself that he was the man she had seen? I mean, she did admit that she could not identify the other man at all. In the end, I can't quite figure out how these two men were suggested as the culprits, other than being seen in the area in the days leading up to the crime and being seen by many people as not very nice men. Were the jury correct to find them guilty? Well, as I've already said, I am a bit baffled by this case, so honestly can't say how they did find them guilty. It simply seems that back then very little evidence was required to find someone guilty of a crime. But I honestly think there was some element of doubt here and not enough evidence of guilt. Was the judge correct to transport them for life? Well, on this one, he simply had no choice. This was the punishment required for being found guilty, so there was no other sentence he could have handed down. But what do you think? Do you even have any idea what on earth went on with this case? Can you clearly see that the men were indeed guilty of the crime? Or do you feel this was simply a case of fitting the crime to two men who were known in the area and had been believed to commit crimes in the past, which would of course have been based on the earlier suggestion that they had got away with robbery a few years prior to this crime? Do you think the jury were correct to find them guilty, or should they have been given the benefit of the doubt and found not guilty? Do you think it was possible that it was some person or persons completely different who had committed the crime? Do please let me know your thoughts on this very, very odd case in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very strange and confusing case interesting. It is probably one of the strangest that I've actually covered. And I do thank you all very much for watching. And I do hope to see you all again next week.